To make our first sketch, we will trace the structure of the skull and face over a reference. If you already have basic drawing skills, you might prefer to make this first sketch on your own instead of tracing it over a reference. There's no problem with this, but if you're not familiar with digital drawing techniques, I recommend you do this first exercise anyway, as through this exercise, we will learn some techniques that will be useful later on. For example, when we have to trace a more detailed second sketch over our own first sketch. As we learned before, the first thing we need to do is create a new layer. To do this, click on the new layer icon and, if you want, change the name of the layer. The second step is to lower the opacity of the reference layer to make it more comfortable to work with. To do this, adjust the opacity slider or enter the numeric value you want. I usually use quite low opacity values, but you can use whatever value you prefer. If you wish, you can also color the reference layer to distinguish it more from the layer we are going to work on. To do this, select the Layer Color option in the Layer Property panel. If for some reason you can't see this panel, you can activate it in the Window menu, Layer Property. Remember also that you can change the size and position of these panels simply by clicking and dragging the mouse. Alternatively, you can use the shortcut Ctrl+B to toggle the coloring of the layer on and off. Great! We're now ready to start drawing. To do so, first, we must make sure we are on the correct layer. If you're not, go to the Layer panel and click on the appropriate layer. Then, select the Pen tool. The parameters we use to draw this first sketch are not very important because this sketch will not be seen in the final result, but I like to work with the basic brush called G-Pen in Clip Studio, a size of 5 or 6, and an opacity around 60%. In addition, I prefer to work with a color other than black, as it allows me to differentiate more clearly the sketch from the reference image. To change the color, the best thing we can do is double-click on this square in the lower left corner. This will open the color panel. In this panel, we have 3 different color wheels to choose our colors from. All 3 are valid, and you can choose the one you like best. All have a slider by which we can choose the main value of the color and a selection panel to adjust the hue. In this top left square, we can see 2 colors. The first, at the top, is the color we had previously selected, in this case, black. The one below is the new color we are selecting at this moment. The fourth icon allows access to predefined color palettes or to color palettes that we have created ourselves. This is useful when we need to maintain color consistency throughout long projects, but it is not relevant at this moment, and we will see it later on. The last icon collects the history of colors we have used recently, although this is a tool I hardly ever use. Anyway, once we have chosen the color we want, in my case, a shade of blue, we can press Enter or the OK button to return to the workspace with our selected color and start working as we have learned before. Remember that the goal is not to trace all the contours and details of the figure, but to abstract the simplified shapes and volumes from it for later. Use this structure to create our character. Therefore, focus on finding the shape of the head and jaw, the eye sockets, the height of the nose and ears, and the mouth. If you want, you can include a couple of lines to mark the location of the neck and collarbone, as I did in this example. If you do it, notice that the point of connection between the neck and the head on a frontal plane like this occurs roughly at the same point where the lower part of the ears connects with the skull. Remember that it's not necessary to be very precise or clean in this step. In most cases, my first sketches are extremely loose and messy. We will clean them up and detail them later. This first step basically involves finding some placeholders over which we can draw more comfortably in the next step, in the second sketch. So don't worry if some lines come out a bit wonky or if your sketch isn't completely symmetrical. We'll correct all that later on. Still, there are some digital tools which can make this work easier and that will be very useful in many other parts of the character design and creation process. One of them is the Straight Line tool. To activate this tool, simply press and hold the Shift key while we have the pen tool selected. If we do this, we'll see how the cursor changes to a straight line that follows our cursor. If we click or press with the digital pen, we'll draw a perfectly straight line in the desired direction. This tool is very useful for finding reference lines and symmetry lines as we are doing now, but it has many other functionalities like drawing swords, sticks, and all kinds of objects with flat planes. There's a method for drawing circles which could also come in handy at this stage and which is also convenient to know as it will be very useful at other times. Unfortunately, the tool for circles and other geometric shapes is not as accessible or intuitive as the Straight Line tool. To make a perfect circle, the best thing we can do is use the Selection tool. We can activate it in the tool panel on the left or via the shortcut we have assigned. In my case, I use the M key. In this panel, at the top left, we can choose different geometric shapes. In this case, we're going to select the ellipse option. With the tool active, if we click anywhere in the workspace and drag the mouse, we'll create an ellipse in the direction in which we move the mouse. If we hold down the Shift key while we do it, we lock the proportions of the figure, creating a perfect circle. When we release the mouse, the selection will be marked by this line of moving dots, and we'll see below a floating panel with many options. We'll see all these functions later on, but for the moment it's enough to know that each one of these buttons is used to perform operations that affect the area we have selected. For example, if we press the paint bucket icon, we'll paint the entire area of the selection we've created. But this is not what we need now, so I'm going to undo the operation by pressing Ctrl+C. What we need is a tool that allows us to draw the outline of this perfect circle. This tool is not available in the floating toolbar, but we can add it and customize the entire toolbar in general by pressing the last icon. The function we need to add is in the Edit menu and then Outline Selection. When we found this function, we can press the Add button to add the button to our toolbar. This way, every time we open the toolbar, the button will be there, easily accessible. We can also click and drag the mouse to put the icon in the position we like best. We can also delete icons we don't use by right-clicking and choosing the Delete option. Later on, we'll look at the functions of these icons and assess whether they are useful to us or not. But for the moment, it's enough to know that this toolbar is fully customizable and that we can always go back to the default toolbar by pressing the Restore Default Layout button in the Selection Launcher Settings panel. For now, we can close the panel and return to our drawing. If we press the button we just added, we'll open the Outline Selection panel we needed with several options. This is the configuration I use. Draw on border, align width, similar to the brush I use, in this case 5 or 6 pixels, and the rest of the default options, which are not very important. If we press the OK button or the Enter key, the program will automatically trace the contour of the selection we've created, defining a perfect circle. Now, click the first icon, Deselect, to clear the selection. If we are working on a separate layer from the rest of the art, we can use the Transform tool, Ctrl+T, to adjust the size and position of our circle. That's why, when looking for these shapes and structural reference lines, it might be a good idea to make each line or geometric shape on a separate layer. This way, I can individually adjust them to the desired position. For example, if I want to find the vertical line of symmetry, I can create a new layer and draw a vertical line on it. Roughly, like this. If I want to adjust the position of the line, I can do so with the Transform tool, as we saw earlier, or with a new tool that I'm going to introduce next, and that is extremely useful, the Object tool. The Object tool is located up here to the left in the tool panel, but as it is a tool I use all the time, I have assigned a shortcut, the V key in my case. You might be wondering why I chose this key and not another. Well, in principle, I always try to have the tools I use the most linked to keys on the left side of the keyboard, which is where I usually place my hand, but it's a relatively arbitrary decision, and of course, you can choose any other key or combination of keys that is more comfortable for you. Down here, in the Tool Property panel, you can see the values I use. If you configure the tool this way, the Object tool allows us to select elements in our workspace and activate the layer they are on automatically. For example, if I click on the reference layer with the Object tool activated, we'll see that the layer becomes active automatically in the Layer panel. If I click on the line I just drew, the layer for the line is the one that becomes active. This is very useful for quickly changing layers, but also if we hold down the mouse instead of just clicking, we can quickly change the position of the selected element. It's very easy and convenient, isn't it? The problem with this method is that if we start creating a new layer for each new element, we can quickly end up with dozens of layers, which can unnecessarily complicate the process, especially since it is a simple first sketch. To avoid this situation, I recommend merging the layers as we become satisfied with the result. For example, if I've already placed these two elements in the correct position, I can merge these two layers before creating a new one. To do so, we need to go to the Layer panel, right-click on the top layer, and select the Merge with Layer Below option. Alternatively, we can also select the two layers by clicking on any of them and shift-click on the next one, or the next ones if we want to merge more than two layers, and choose the Merge Selected Layers option. Since merging layers is an operation you'll probably need to perform frequently, I recommend creating a shortcut for it. In my case, I chose the Ctrl-E key combination. With all these techniques and tools, we can continue with our exercise. As a practice, I recommend you use the Straight Line tool, the Selection tool, and the Object tool to mark the structural reference points of our character's head. I'm going to go through the process in real time, so you can see that this is a very simple and quick process. As we learned earlier, I am using the Straight Line tool and some ellipses to mark the structure of the head and the line of the eyes. To mark the placement of the eyes, we can turn to a little trick that will help us improve the symmetry and proportionality of our sketch. Instead of creating two different ellipses, one for each eye, it's faster and more accurate to create just one on an independent layer and copy that layer. To do so, simply right-click on the layer and choose the Duplicate Layer option. Apparently, nothing has happened, but if we use the Object tool, we can move this new layer to the desired position, and in this way, we now have two perfectly identical eyes. Remember to merge the layers when you have finished placing them. To finish the head, continue using the Straight Line tool to define the rest of the reference points we identified earlier. The nose, the shape of the jaw, the ears, etc. Let me give you a little note on anatomy. As we see, the heads usually narrow down as we approach the tip of the jaw, but something a bit harder to see and which some artists don't take into account is that in general the heads usually widen a bit above the line of the ears, around the temples. In this case, the character's hair does not allow us to see it clearly, but the outline of this character's skull should be something more or less like this. At this point, let me show you another quick trick that will help you save a lot of time on front view sketches or any that are symmetrical in some other way. In cases like this, we can save ourselves the effort of drawing 50% of the picture by using the duplicate layer and transform tool. Let's suppose I started the sketch from scratch and have only completed the first left part of the head. What I can do now is copy the layer, as we learned before, and then press Ctrl T to activate the transform tool. Then, by pressing this icon here, at the bottom left, we can flip the layer over its vertical axis. Exactly what we need. Now, all we have to do is move the layer into its corresponding place to have the other 50% of the drawing ready in seconds. And along the way, ensure it has practically perfect symmetry. Whether you've used a direct reference or not, the result of this exercise should be something like this. Remember, this is not the final sketch of our character, but an initial approach to the structure that will allow us to start working on design and expressiveness according to our style and preferences. We will work on all of this in the second sketch, but before that, we'll reflect briefly on issues of technique and style in our next lesson. This activity is similar to the previous one. This time, we are going to abstract the basic cranial and facial structure from a reference, but instead of using the pen tool freehand, I recommend that you use the tools to create perfect geometric shapes and straight lines. This way, in addition to practicing basic anatomy, you will become familiar with some tools that will be very useful to you in the future.